Chapter 1. The Cryptic Summons. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate shadows on the parlour table. She sat with a cup of tea, her knitting needles clicking softly, when the postman's knock interrupted her thoughts. Among the usual letters was a thick envelope, its black ink scrawled in an unsteady hand. The return address read, Blackthorne Manor, Grimwold Heath. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes narrowed as she opened it. The letter was brief, penned by a certain Mrs. Eleanor Vance, who claimed urgency but offered little detail. Dear Miss Marple, your reputation as a solver of mysteries precedes you. I implore you to visit Blackthorne Manor at once. A matter most peculiar, a painting that weeps blood, has brought fear and discord to our household. I fear it is no mere trick. Please come. Discretion is paramount. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Vance. Miss Marple set the letter down, her lips pursing. A painting that weeps blood, she murmured. How very theatrical. She had seen her share of village dramas, jealousies disguised as piety, greed cloaked in grief. But this was novel. The mention of blood intrigued her, not for its sensationalism, but for what it might conceal. People she knew often hid their darkest truths behind spectacle. She glanced at the clock. The next train to Grimwold Heath left in 2 hours. Packing, a small valise with essentials, a shawl, her notebook, and a battered copy of The Vicar of Wakefield for the journey. She sent a telegram to Mrs. Vance, confirming her arrival the following morning. As she locked her cottage door, a chill wind stirred the roses, and Miss Marple wondered if Blackthorne Manor's mystery would prove as thorny. The train journey was uneventful, save for a talkative vicar who prattled about local folklore. Grimwold? Heath's an odd place, he said, leaning closer. They say Blackthorne Manor's cursed. Built on old monastic land, you know. Paintings don't cry without reason. Miss Marple smiled politely, filing his words away. Curses, in her experience, were often excuses for human mischief. By dawn, she was in a hired car rattling along a mist-shrouded road. Grimwold Heath was bleak, its fields dotted with gnarled trees that seemed to claw at the sky. Blackthorne Manor loomed at the end of a gravel drive, a sprawling Gothic pile with ivy-choked walls and gargoyles leering from its eaves. Its windows glinted like watchful eyes. A butler, gaunt and sombre, greeted her at the door. Mrs. Vance is expecting you, he said, his voice a low rasp. He led her through a dim hall where portraits of stern-faced ancestors glared down. Miss Marple noted the dust on the frames and the faint scent of damp. The manor felt alive with secrets, its silence heavy with unspoken words. Mrs. Eleanor Vance awaited in a drawing-room, a frail woman in her 60s with anxious eyes and a trembling hand. Miss Marple, thank heaven you've come, she whispered, Missouri said, clasping her hands. It's the portrait in the great hall. It weeps blood, real blood. We're all terrified. My nephew Charles thinks it's a prank, but I'm not so sure. Someone in this house knows more than they're saying. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. A painting that cries is certainly unusual, she said mildly. But tears, even bloody ones, often have a human source. May I see it? Mrs. Vance nodded, rising unsteadily. This way, but be warned, it's unsettling. As they moved towards the great hall, Miss Marple's mind was already at work. A weeping painting was a puzzle, and puzzles, she knew, were made to be solved. Behind the theatrics there would be motives, envy, revenge, perhaps greed. And Miss Jane Marple intended to find them. Detective, where are you solving from? Drop your location below. Want more chilling cases? Subscribe. Tomorrow's mystery gets darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. Arrival at the Manor. The great hall of Blackthorne Manor was a cavernous space, its high ceiling lost in shadows, and its walls lined with tapestries faded by time. Miss Jane Marple followed Mrs. Eleanor Vance, her sensible shoes echoing on the polished floor. A faint chill hung in the air, and the scent of old wood mingled with something sharper. Iron, perhaps. At the far end of the hall, lit by a single candelabrum, hung the portrait. "There it is," Mrs. Vance whispered, her voice trembling. "The crying lady." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and stepped closer. The painting was striking. A young woman in a crimson gown, her dark eyes wide with sorrow, her hands clasped as if in prayer. The brushwork was exquisite, capturing a haunting beauty. But what drew Miss Marple's attention were the streaks of red, glistening as if fresh, trailing from the woman's painted eyes down her cheeks. The liquid pooled at the frame's edge, dripping onto a silver tray placed below. "Remarkable," Miss Marple said softly, her tone betraying neither fear nor fascination. She leaned forward, noting the texture of the tears. They looked convincing, but looks, she knew, were often deceptive. "When did this begin?" "3 weeks ago," Mrs. Vance replied, wringing her hands. "At first we thought it a prank. Charles, my nephew, laughed it off. But it happens every few days, always at dusk. The servants refuse to clean it. They say it's cursed." Marple's eyes flickered to the tray. "A practical solution, at least," she murmured. "Who placed this here?" "The butler, Mr. Grimsby. He thought it respectful." Before Miss Marple could reply, the hall's heavy doors creaked open, admitting a flurry of voices. A group of residents entered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Mrs. Vance introduced them hastily. Charles Vance, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s, had a careless grin that didn't reach his eyes. His wife, Lydia, was pale and sharp-featured, her gaze darting to the portrait. Then there was Miss Clara Duval, an artist and distant cousin, whose ink-stained fingers fidgeted with a sketchbook. Finally, Dr. Mortimer Hale, a retired physician staying as a guest, adjusted his pince-nez and muttered about hysteria. "Miss Marple, is it?" Charles said, his tone jovial but edged. "Come to solve our ghostly riddle. I say it's a trick, some clever plumbing in the walls." "Plumbing doesn't bleed, Charles," Lydia snapped, her voice brittle. "You saw it last night. It's unnatural." Clara Duval shivered. "It's her eyes. They follow you. I've tried sketching her, but I can't capture that." Dr. Hale cleared his throat. "Nonsense. A chemical reaction, perhaps. Certain pigments degrade oddly." Miss Marple listened, her mild expression masking the quick workings of her mind. Charles's dismissal seemed forced, Lydia's fear too theatrical. Clara's unease felt genuine, but her artist's eye might see more than she admitted. And Dr. Hale's rationality could hide a deeper agenda. People, she reflected, were like her knitting patterns, simple on the surface, tangled beneath. "May I examine the frame?" Miss Marple asked, stepping toward the portrait. Mrs. Vance nodded, and Miss Marple ran her fingers along the ornate wood, checking for hidden panels or tubes. Nothing obvious, but she noted a faint scratch near the top, barely visible. A clue, perhaps, or merely age. As she stepped back, the candles flickered, and a single red drop fell from the portrait's eye, splattering on the tray. Lydia gasped, and Clara crossed herself. Charles swore under his breath, while Dr. Hale peered closer, muttering about viscosity. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Most intriguing," she said. "Mrs. Vance, might I see my room? A little rest, and I shall be ready to learn more about your tearful lady." As they left the hall, Miss Marple glanced back. The portrait's eyes seemed to meet hers, and for a moment she felt a prickle of unease. But unease, she knew, was merely a signal to look closer. Chapter 3. The Weeping Witness. The great hall of Blackthorne Manor seemed to hold its breath as dusk settled over Grimwold Heath. Miss Jane Marple stood before the portrait of the crying lady, her hands clasped neatly, her eyes scanning the faces of the gathered household. Mrs. Eleanor Vance had insisted they witness the phenomenon together, hoping Miss Marple's presence might steady their nerves, or reveal a truth. The candelabram's flames cast long shadows, and the air was thick with anticipation. "It always happens now," Mrs. Vance whispered, her voice barely audible, "when the light fades." Charles Vance lounged against a pillar, his arms crossed. "Waste of time," he muttered, though his eyes flicked to the painting. Lydia, his wife, clutched a handkerchief, her knuckles white. Clara Duval, the artist, stood apart, her sketchbook open but untouched, her gaze fixed on the portrait's sorrowful eyes. Dr. Mortimer Hale adjusted his pince-nez, his expression one of sceptical curiosity. The butler, Mr. Grimsby, hovered near the door, his gaunt face unreadable. Miss Marple observed them all, her mild demeanour masking the quick tally of their reactions. Fear, defiance, fascination. Each told a story. She noted Charles's forced nonchalance, the way Lydia's eyes darted to her husband, and Clara's trembling fingers. Dr. Hale's scientific detachment seemed almost too deliberate, and Grimsby's stillness suggested more than servile duty. A faint chime from the manor's clock marked the hour. As if on cue, a low murmur rippled through the group. Miss Marple's gaze snapped to the portrait. A single red droplet welled in the painted woman's left eye, quivering like a jewel before sliding down her cheek. Another followed from the right, then another, until twin trails of crimson glistened on the canvas. The drops fell to the silver tray below, with soft, deliberate plinks. Lydia stifled a cry, pressing her handkerchief to her mouth. Charles swore softly, his bravado faltering. Clara's pencil slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. Dr. Hale leaned closer, muttering, "Fascinating! The consistency!" Only Grimsby remained impassive, though Miss Marple caught the briefest tightening of his jaw. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Vance gasped. "You see, it's no trick!" Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression calm, but her mind racing. The blood was vivid, its scent faintly metallic, yet something about its flow seemed too precise, too staged. She bent slightly, examining the tray. The liquid pooled evenly, no splatter, no irregularity. A natural phenomenon would be messier, she thought. This was crafted. Most curious, she said aloud, her tone light. Tell me, Mrs. Vance, has anyone touched the painting since the weeping began? No one dares, Mrs. Vance replied. The servants avoid it, and we've kept our distance. Wise, Miss Marple murmured, though her eyes lingered on Clara, who flinched under her gaze. An artist might know how to manipulate a canvas, she mused. Or perhaps Charles, so quick to dismiss, was deflecting suspicion. Even Dr. Hale, with his chemical knowledge, could concoct such a ruse. She straightened, turning to the group. Might I ask where each of you was this afternoon, just to understand the manor's routine? Charles snorted. What, are we suspects now? Merely curious, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. In a village like St. Mary Mead, routines reveal so much. Reluctantly they answered. Charles claimed he'd been in the stables, Lydia in her room with a headache. Clara had been sketching in the garden, Dr. Hale reading in the library, and Grimsby overseeing the kitchen. Miss Marple nodded, storing each detail, knowing lies, often hid in the mundane. As the group dispersed, the portrait's crimson tears slowed, leaving the crying lady's face streaked and silent. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze tracing the frame's faint scratch from the day before. You have a story to tell, she said softly to the painting, and I shall hear it. Chapter 4. Tales of the Cursed Canvas. The morning after the portraits. Chilling display. Miss Jane Marple sat in Blackthorne Manor's library, a cup of tepid tea at her elbow. The room was a treasure trove of dust-covered books and faded maps, its tall windows admitting a weak grey light. Mrs. Eleanor Vance had promised to join her, but Miss Marple welcomed the quiet. Libraries, she knew, held more than books. They held secrets. Her notebook lay open, filled with neat observations. Charles's forced bravado, Lydia's nervous glances, Clara's unease, Dr. Hale's clinical detachment, Grimsby's watchful silence. The painting's blood intrigued her most, not its spectacle, but its purpose. Someone in this house wanted it seen, feared, believed. But why? Mrs. Vance entered, clutching a leather-bound volume. I found it, she said breathlessly. The manor's history. It mentions the portrait. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. How thoughtful, Mrs. Vance. Shall we explore it together? They sat by a cracked leather armchair, and Mrs. Vance opened the book to a yellowed page. The text, written by a 19th-century ancestor, described Blackthorne Manor's origins on monastic land, its wealth built on wool and ambition. But Miss Marple's attention fixed on a passage about the crying lady. In 1847, the portrait of Lady Beatrice Vance was hung in the Great Hall, painted by the reclusive artist Julian Moreau. It captured her beauty and sorrow. Beatrice, betrothed to Lord Edmund Vance, died tragically the night before their wedding, found lifeless at the foot of the manor's cliffs. Some whispered of betrayal, others of a curse. Moreau vanished soon after, leaving the painting as his final work. Mrs. Vance's voice wavered. The weeping began after her death, or so the story goes. It stopped for generations, until now. Miss Marple nodded, her mind sifting details. A tragic love story was fertile ground for grudges, and a missing artist suggested loose ends. "This Julian Moreau," she said. "Is anything known of him?" Mrs. Vance shook her head. "Only rumours. He was brilliant but unstable, they say. Some thought he loved Beatrice himself. An artist's heart can be a tangled thing," Miss Marple murmured, thinking of Clara Duval's ink-stained fingers. She flipped through the book, finding a sketch of the portrait. The resemblance to the painting was uncanny, but the eyes in the sketch lacked the haunting depth of the original. Was the painting ever restored? "Not that I know," Mrs. Vance said. "It's been untouched for decades." Miss Marple made a mental note. An old canvas could hide modern tricks. She closed the book, her gaze drifting to a nearby shelf, where a small locked box caught her eye. "And that?" she asked lightly. Mrs. Vance flushed. "Oh, just old family papers. Charles keeps the key." "Families do love their secrets," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, but her curiosity piqued. She stood smoothing her skirt. "Might we visit the cliffs where Beatrice died? A walk often clarifies the mind." The cliffs were a short walk from the manor, a jagged edge where the land dropped to a churning sea. The wind whipped Miss Marple's shawl as she studied the rocky path. No railings, no markers. A perfect place for an accident or something darker. Mrs. Vance pointed to a spot below. "That's where they found her." Miss Marple's eyes traced the cliff's edge, noting a faint indentation in the grass, recent but subtle. "Time erases much," she said, "but not everything." As they returned to the manor, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. Beatrice's death, Moreau's disappearance, the weeping portrait. Each piece hinted at a betrayal, old or new. Someone was stirring the past, and she suspected the answer lay not in curses, but in the living hearts within Blackthorne's walls. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Night. The moon hung low over Blackthorne Manor, its pale light seeping through the great hall's tall windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near the portrait of the crying lady, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles idle in her lap. The household had retired hours ago, but she had persuaded Mrs. Vance to let her keep a vigil by the painting. "Night," she had said mildly, "often reveals what day conceals." The hall was silent save for the occasional creak of the manor's ancient timbers. The portrait loomed above, its crimson streaks dry now, the crying lady's eyes seeming to glint in the moonlight. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, but her senses were alert, attuned to the faintest sound or shadow. She had seen too many village intrigues to believe in ghosts, but she knew the living could stage a haunting as deftly as any spectre. At midnight, a faint scuff broke the silence, like a shoe on stone. Miss Marple's hands stilled, her eyes narrowing. The sound came from the far end of the hall, near a heavy tapestry. She waited, her breath slow and even. A moment later, a shadow flickered, a figure cloaked in darkness, moving toward the portrait. Miss Marple's voice cut through the quiet, soft, but firm. "Good evening. A late hour for a stroll, is it not?" The figure froze, then stepped into the moonlight. It was Clara Duval, her face pale, her artist's smock smudged with paint. "Miss Marple!" she gasped, clutching a small bundle. I couldn't sleep. I thought to sketch the portrait by night." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. "A fine idea, Miss Duval, though sketching requires light, and you've brought none." She gestured to Clara's empty hands, save for the bundle, a cloth perhaps, or a tool. Clara flushed, tucking the bundle behind her. I changed my mind." "Understandable," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. "The crying lady is unsettling. Have you noticed anything odd about her tonight?" Clara hesitated, her gaze darting to the painting. "No, she's quiet now. No tears." Miss Marple nodded, filing away Clara's unease. Before she could press further, a sharp crack echoed from above, a door slamming, or something heavier. Clara flinched, and Miss Marple's head tilted. "The manor is restless," she remarked. "Shall we see what stirs?" Reluctantly, Clara followed as Miss Marple rose, moving toward the staircase. The sound had come from the upper gallery, a narrow corridor lined with lesser portraits. As they climbed, Miss Marple noted a faint smear on the banister, red like paint or pigment, fresh enough to glisten. Not blood, she thought, but meant to look like it. At the gallery's end, a window stood ajar, its latch broken. Beyond it, the cliff path stretched into the darkness. Miss Marple peered out, her mind racing. Someone had been here, perhaps watching her vigil, perhaps fleeing. The smear on the banister suggested haste, and haste suggested guilt. "Miss Duval," she said, turning, "do you often walk the cliffs at night?" Clara shook her head, her eyes wide. "Never. It's dangerous." "Quite," Miss Marple murmured. She closed the window, noting a scrap of fabric caught in the latch. Grey, like a servant's uniform. Grimsby, perhaps? Or another? "We should return to bed. But do be careful, my dear. Nighttime wanderers may not always be artists." As they parted, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. Clara's bundle, the red smear, the broken latch, small threads in a larger pattern. The crying lady's tears were no accident, and someone in Blackthorne Manor was weaving a dangerous deception. She would watch and wait for the next tear to fall. Chapter 6. The Alibis Unravel. The morning sun struggled through Blackthorne Manor's heavy drapes, casting a muted glow over the breakfast room. Miss Jane Marple sat at the table, her tea untouched, her eyes quietly assessing the gathered household. The events of the previous night, the shadow by the portrait, Clara's nervous explanation, the red smear on the banister, had sharpened her focus. Someone was orchestrating the crying lady's tears, and she intended to find out who. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, pale and fretful, picked at her toast. Charles Vance slouched in his chair, his jovial mask slipping into irritability. Lydia, his wife, stirred her coffee with a clatter, her eyes red-rimmed. Clara Duval sat apart, her sketchbook closed, her fingers twisting a napkin. Dr. Mortimer Hale, ever the sceptic, read a newspaper, though Miss Marple noted his glances over the rim. The butler, Mr. Grimsby, moved silently, pouring tea with mechanical precision. Miss Marple broke the tense silence. "A curious night," she said mildly. "I couldn't help but notice some activity in the manor. Might anyone have been about after midnight?" Charles snorted. "Snooping, are we? I was in bed snoring like a bear. Ask Lydia." Lydia's spoon froze. "You were restless," she said, her voice tight. "You got up around 1, said you needed air." Charles's jaw tightened. "Rubbish! You were half asleep." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Easily done. And you, Miss Duval? You were sketching, I believe?" Clara flinched, her cheeks flushing. I told you, I changed my mind. I went back to my room." "Alone?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. Clara nodded too quickly. Dr. Hale lowered his paper. "I was in my study reviewing notes on pigments. The painting's phenomenon fascinates me, scientifically, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes lingering on him. "And Mr. Grimsby?" The butler paused, his expression impassive. "I was in the servants' quarters, ma'am. I heard nothing unusual." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing inconsistencies. Charles's denial contradicted Lydia's account. Clara's story felt rehearsed, and Dr. Hale's late night at research was convenient. Grimsby's calm was almost too perfect, like a village grocer she'd once known, who'd poisoned his wife with similar poise. She shifted tack. "Mrs. Vance, you mentioned the artist Julian Moreau. Was he connected to anyone in the family beyond Beatrice?" Mrs. Vance hesitated. "There were rumours. My great-aunt said Moreau was enamoured with Beatrice. Some thought he painted the portrait to immortalise her, or to curse the Vances for her death." Clara's napkin tore slightly in her grip. "He was a genius," she said softly. "His technique, layered oils, hidden textures. I've studied his work." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How fortunate to have an artist among us. Have you examined the portrait closely, Miss Duval?" Clara paled. Only from a distance." "Wise," Miss Marple said, though she noted Clara's lie. An artist's curiosity would draw her nearer, especially one so fixated on Moreau. She turned to Dr. Hale. "You mentioned pigments, Doctor. Could a modern chemical mimic blood?" Hale adjusted his pince-nez. "Certainly. Ferric compounds, for instance, could produce a convincing red, but it would require skill and access." "Access," Miss Marple echoed, her gaze sweeping the table. Everyone had access to the Great Hall, but motive was murkier. Greed? Revenge? A desire to frighten Mrs. Vance from the manor? She recalled the locked box in the library. Charles held the key, and secrets often hid behind locks. As breakfast ended, Miss Marple rose, her expression placid. "A lovely meal. I think I'll take a turn in the garden. Fresh air does wonders. For clarity." She left the room, aware of the eyes following her. The crying lady's tears were a puzzle, but the real mystery lay in the tangled motives of Blackthorne's residents. One of them was lying, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel the truth. Chapter 7. The Chemist's Revelation. The midday light did little to warm Blackthorne Manor's draughty corridors, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village of Grimwold Heath. The breakfast table's strained alibis had left her with more questions than answers, and Dr. Hale's mention of chemical pigments had sparked an idea. If the crying lady's blood was no miracle, a scientific mind might unravel its composition. She had persuaded Mrs. Vance to arrange a visit to Mr. Percival Wren, the local chemist, who had a reputation for precision and discretion. The chemist's shop was a cramped, cluttered space, its shelves lined with glass bottles and faded labels. Mr. Wren, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetual squint, greeted Miss Marple with a nod. Mrs. Vance sent word, he said, adjusting his spectacles. You'll hear about the manor's peculiarity? Indeed, Miss Marple said, her tone mild. She produced a small vial, carefully filled with a sample of the portrait's crimson tears, collected that morning with Grimsby's reluctant assistance. I'd be most grateful if you could analyse this. It appears to be blood, but appearances, as you know, can deceive. Mr. Wren's eyes gleamed with curiosity. A challenge. Let's see what we're dealing with. He set to work, heating the sample, adding reagents, and peering through a microscope. Miss Marple watched, her hands folded, her mind sifting through the morning's observations. Charles's evasiveness, Clara's fixation on Moreau, Dr. Hale's chemical knowledge, each pointed to a calculated deception, but the motive remained elusive. After a tense half-hour, Mr. Wren straightened, his brow furrowed. Not blood, he declared. It's a clever imitation. Ferric oxide mixed with a glycerin base, tinted with a trace of carmine. The viscosity mimics blood, and the metallic scent is deliberate. Someone's gone to great lengths. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. How fascinating! Could such a mixture be prepared by an amateur? Wren shook his head. It requires precision, knowledge of compounds and their interactions. A physician, perhaps, or an artist familiar with pigments. Ferric oxide is common in paints, carmine less so, but both are procurable. Procurable, Miss Marple echoed, her mind flashing to Clara's paint-stained smock and Dr. Hale's late-night research. And how might it be applied to a painting without detection? A hidden reservoir, Wren suggested. A say, small tube or bladder behind the canvas, triggered by pressure or a timer. The frame could conceal it. Miss Marple nodded, recalling the faint scratch on the portrait's frame. Most helpful, Mr. Wren. One last question. Have you sold ferric oxide or carmine recently? Wren consulted a ledger, his finger tracing the entries. 2 months ago, a small quantity of carmine to a Miss Duval. She said it was for her artwork. Ferric oxide is common. I've sold it to several, including Dr. Hale, for an experiment. Thank you, Miss Marple said, her expression serene but her thoughts racing. Clara's purchase was no surprise, but Dr. Hale's involvement added a new thread to the tangle. As she left the shop, the village clock chimed, and she glanced toward the cliffs, their jagged outlines stark against the sky. The manor's secrets were rooted in the past, but this deception was modern, meticulous, and personal. Back at Blackthorne, Miss Marple found the great hall empty, the portrait silent. She studied its frame, her fingers brushing the scratch she'd noted earlier. It was deeper than she'd thought, as if something had been pried open. A reservoir, perhaps, or a clue to the mechanism behind the tears. As she turned to leave, a shadow moved in the corridor. Grimsby, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he vanished. Miss Marple's smile was faint. The chemist's revelation had narrowed her focus, but the heart of the mystery lay in why someone wanted the crying lady to weep. That, she knew, would require a different kind of chemistry. Human nature. Chapter 8. The Locked Study. The afternoon light filtered weakly through Blackthorne Manor's stained glass windows, casting fractured colours across the great hall. Miss Jane Marple stood before the portrait of the crying lady, her eyes tracing the frame's faint scratch. now confirmed by the chemist's findings as a likely clue to a hidden mechanism. The blood, ferric oxide and carmine, was a deliberate deception, but its purpose remained shrouded. She needed more than chemical truths. She needed the manor's secrets. Recalling the locked box in the library, mentioned by Mrs. Vance and guarded by Charles's key, Miss Marple decided to investigate. The library was quiet, its air heavy with the scent of old leather and mildew. The box, small and iron-bound, sat on a shelf, its lock gleaming as if recently polished. Miss Marple's fingers brushed its surface, noting a faint indentation, a dent perhaps from a fall. Curious, she thought. A locked box was a magnet for secrets, and Charles's reluctance to discuss it suggested he knew its value. As she pondered how to access it, a soft click echoed from the wall behind the portrait's usual place in the great hall, audible through the library's open door. Miss Marple's head tilted. The sound was mechanical, like a latch releasing. Moving silently, she approached the hall and peered around the corner. The portrait hung undisturbed, but the panelling beneath it seemed slightly ajar, a hairline gap betraying a hidden seam. Her heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. A secret passage was no surprise in a manor this old, but its timing suggested someone was watching, or working, behind the scenes. She glanced around, ensuring she was alone, then pressed the panel. It yielded with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A faint draught carried the smell of damp stone, and something sharper, paint perhaps, or chemicals. Miss Marple hesitated, her practical side urging caution, but curiosity won. She fetched a candle from the library and descended, her steps careful, on the worn stone. The staircase ended in a small, windowless study, its walls lined with shelves of mouldering books and jars of dried pigments. A desk held a scattering of papers, and atop it sat a tattered diary, its cover embossed with the initials J.M., Julian Moreau, the portrait's artist. Her pulse quickened as she opened the diary. The entries, dated 1847, were frantic, detailing Moreau's love for Beatrice Vance and his despair at her betrothal to Lord Edmund. One passage stood out. She confided in me tonight. Edmund's cruelty, his greed for her dowry. I begged her to flee, but she fears the cliffs. If she dies, I shall ensure the truth lives in her portrait. The Vances will never escape her tears. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The diary suggested Beatrice's death was no accident, and Moreau's painting was a deliberate act of vengeance. She scanned the room, noting a small vial of carmine powder and a rusted tool, perhaps used to carve a reservoir into the portrait's frame. The weeping mechanism, it seemed, had been Moreau's design, revived by someone modern. A sudden creak from the staircase made her freeze. Candlelight flickered, casting wild shadows. She slipped the diary into her shawl and blew out the candle, pressing herself against the wall. Footsteps descended, slow and deliberate. A figure paused at the study's threshold, their silhouette indistinct but familiar. Tall, like Charles, or perhaps Grimsby's gaunt frame. Miss Marple held her breath, her mind racing. The figure lingered, then retreated, the panel above clicking shut. She waited, counting to 100, before relighting the candle and ascending. The hall was empty, but the portrait's eyes seemed to follow her, gleaming with silent accusation. The locked study had yielded a vital clue, but it also raised a question. Who else knew of Moreau's secret, and why were they making the crying lady weep again? Chapter 9. The Second Weeping. The great hall of Blackthorne Manor was steeped in an uneasy hush as dusk approached, the hour when the crying lady's tears often fell. Miss Jane Marple sat near the portrait, her notebook open, her eyes alert behind, her spectacles. The hidden study and Julian Moreau's diary had confirmed the weeping mechanism's origins, a vengeful artist's design, but someone in the present was reviving it. The question was who and why Mrs. Eleanor Vance had gathered the household again, her frail hands trembling as she insisted they face the phenomenon together. Charles Vance stood with a scowl, his arms crossed, while Lydia clutched a shawl, her eyes darting nervously. Clara Duval, pale and withdrawn, avoided the portrait's gaze, her fingers stained with fresh paint. Dr. Mortimer Hale adjusted his pince-nez, his expression one of forced calm. Mr. Grimsby, the butler, lingered near the door, his face a mask of stoic duty. Miss Marple's thoughts churned. The diary suggested a motive tied to Beatrice's death, but the modern tears hinted at a new grievance. Perhaps inheritance, revenge, or a bid to drive Mrs. Vance from the manor. The figure in the hidden study last night had been too fleeting to identify, but their presence confirmed her suspicions. Someone was manipulating the portrait. As the manor's clock chimed 6, a collective gasp broke the silence. A single crimson droplet welled in the crying lady's painted eye, quivering before sliding down her cheek. Another followed, then a third, each drop falling to the silver tray below with a soft plink. The scent of iron filled the air, sharper than before. Lydia whimpered, pressing her hands to her face. Charles muttered a curse, his bravado crumbling. Clara's breath hitched, and she stepped back, her sketchbook slipping to the floor. Dr. Hale leaned closer, murmuring about chemical consistency, while Grimsby's eyes narrowed, his stillness almost predatory. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate. "Most striking," she said, her voice calm. She approached the portrait, her gaze fixed on the frame. The scratch she'd noted earlier was more pronounced now, as if recently disturbed. Bending slightly, she examined the tray, then froze. A faint smudge marred its edge, a fingerprint smeared in the crimson liquid, barely visible but unmistakable. "Mrs. Vance," Miss Marple said, turning, "might we have a cloth? The tray needs cleaning." Grimsby stepped forward with a cloth, but Miss Marple waved him back. "No, thank you, Mr. Grimsby. I'd prefer to handle it myself." She took a handkerchief from her bag, carefully wiping the tray while preserving the fingerprint's outline. She folded the handkerchief and tucked it away, her expression serene, but her mind racing. A fingerprint was tangible, traceable. Slipped by someone careless or rushed. "Clara," Miss Marple said gently, "you've studied the portrait's technique. Have you ever touched the frame?" Clara's eyes widened. "No, I wouldn't. It's too unsettling." "Quite," Miss Marple said, noting Clara's trembling hands. She turned to Dr. Hale. "And you, Doctor, your experiments with pigments, have they brought you close to the painting?" Hale bristled. "I've observed it, nothing more. I'm no vandal." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze lingering on Charles, whose fingers twitched as if itching to flee. The fingerprint could belong to any of them, or none, if the culprit was cunning. But its presence suggested haste, and haste meant pressure. Someone was growing desperate. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the portrait. The crying lady's tears had slowed, but the fingerprint was a tear of another kind, a mistake that brought her closer to the truth. She would need to compare it perhaps with the manor's staff, or a subtle test. For now, she knew one thing. The weeper was no ghost, but a living soul with a secret to hide. Chapter 10. The Family's Burden. The wind howled outside Blackthorne Manor, rattling the windows as Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, a faded tapestry of the Vance family crest above her. The fingerprint on the portrait's tray, preserved in her handkerchief, was a tantalizing clue, but identifying it required caution. For now, she turned her attention to the manor's past, sensing the crying lady's tears were tied to a legacy of secrets. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, at Miss Marple's gentle urging, had agreed to share the family's darker tales. Hoping to shed light on the painting's curse, Mrs. Vance clutched a shawl, her eyes haunted. "You've read of Beatrice's death," she began, her voice low. "But there's more. The Vances have long believed the manor is cursed, not by ghosts but by guilt. Beatrice's fall from the cliffs was no accident, some say. Her dowry was vast, and my great-uncle, Lord Edmund, needed it to save the estate." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "A convenient tragedy," she said softly. "Was there evidence of foul play?" "None," Mrs. Vance admitted, but whispers persisted. Edmund remarried quickly, and his new wife bore Charles's grandfather. The family prospered, but every generation faced misfortune, illness, bankruptcy, early deaths. When the portrait began weeping in 1847, they called it Beatrice's curse, a warning of betrayal. Miss Marple nodded, her mind sifting through Julian Moreau's diary, with its hints of Edmund's cruelty. And the weeping stopped until recently. What changed? Mrs. Vance hesitated. I plan to sell the manor. It's a burden. Repairs, taxes. Charles opposed it fiercely. He's attached to the estate. Lydia wants the money, though, and Clara, she's been obsessed with the portrait, saying it's a masterpiece that must stay. An artist's passion, Miss Marple murmured, recalling Clara's paint-stained fingers and her purchase of carmine. And Dr. Hale, has he an interest in the manor's fate? He's a guest, but he's been cataloguing our artefacts, offering to broker sales. He says the portrait could fetch a fortune, curse or no. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A fortune was motive enough for deception, whether to keep the manor or force its sale. She thought of Grimsby too, his silent efficiency and the grey fabric in the window latch. Servants often knew more than they told, and loyalty could mask darker aims. "Mrs. Vance," she said, "you mentioned a locked box in the library. Might it hold papers related to Beatrice or the estate?" Mrs. Vance flushed. "Possibly. Charles guards it jealously. He says it's just old deeds, but I've never seen inside." Miss Marple made a mental note to pursue the box, suspecting it held more than deeds, perhaps proof of Edmund's guilt or a clue to the current scheme. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance. Might I borrow the manor's history book again?" A detail may have escaped me. Alone in the library, Miss Marple reread the passage on Beatrice, noting a reference to a missing locket, last seen the night she died. A locket could be sentimental or incriminating. She closed the book, her gaze drifting to the locked box. Charles's key was a hurdle, but villages like St. Mary Mead had taught her that locks yielded to persistence. As she left the library, a faint creak came from the great hall. Peering in, she saw the portrait, its crimson tears dry, but its eyes gleaming. A shadow moved near the panel to the hidden study, too quick to identify. Miss Marple's smile was faint. The family's burden was heavy, but the true curse was greed, and someone in Blackthorne Manor was weaving Beatrice's tragedy into a modern deception. The fingerprint, the diary, the locket. She was close, and the crying lady's next tear might be the last. Chapter 11. The Final Gathering. The grand hall of Blackthorne Manor was ablaze with candlelight, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the portrait of the crying lady. Miss Jane Marple stood at the room's centre, her small figure commanding despite her unassuming air. She had requested the household gather, and they complied, their faces a mix of apprehension and defiance. The fingerprint, Moreau's diary, the locked box, and the family's cursed history had woven a clear pattern in her mind. Tonight, the alibi, crying lady's tears would reveal their maker. Mrs. Eleanor Vance sat rigidly, her hands clasped. Charles Vance slouched, his scowl barely hiding unease. Lydia, pale and fidgety, clutched a handkerchief. Clara Duval stood near the portrait, her fierce eyes darting to its frame. Dr. Mortimer Hale adjusted his pince-nez, his scepticism tinged with curiosity. Mr. Grimsby, the butler, lingered by the door, his gaunt face impassive. Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "Thank you for coming. The crying lady has wept long enough, and her tears, I believe, are no curse but a deception. A clever one, rooted in human motives." Charles snorted. "Here we go. More detective nonsense." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Patience, Mr. Vance. Let us begin with facts. The tears are not blood, but a mixture of ferric oxide, glycerin, and carmine, as confirmed by Mr. Wren, the chemist. This requires skill and access, suggesting someone with knowledge of pigments or chemicals." Dr. Hale cleared his throat. "A scientific trick, as I suspected." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. "But the mechanism, likely a reservoir behind the frame, as designed by Julian Moreau in 1847, was reactivated recently. Moreau's diary, found in a hidden study, reveals his love for Beatrice Vance, and his belief that Lord Edmund murdered her for her dowry. The weeping was his vengeance, meant to haunt the Vances." Mrs. Vance gasped. "Then it's true, the curse." "No curse," Miss Marple said gently. "Only greed and fear. Someone revived the tears to manipulate this household, perhaps to prevent the manor's sale or to claim a hidden prize." She produced the handkerchief with the fingerprint. "This, left on the tray during the last weeping, is our key." Clara paled, her hands trembling. Miss Marple continued. "The locked box in the library, guarded by Charles, held my interest. With Mrs. Vance's permission, I examined it today, after borrowing Charles's key during breakfast." Charles's face reddened, but she pressed on. Inside were letters from Edmund, confessing Beatrice's murder, and her locket stolen the night she died. Its value is considerable, but its exposure would ruin the Vance name. Lydia's eyes widened. You mean someone wanted the locket? Or its secret, Miss Marple said. But the tears were a distraction, meant to frighten Mrs. Vance into leaving or to force a sale. The fingerprint, however, betrays the culprit. She turned to Clara. Miss Duval, your purchase of Carmine, your obsession with Moreau, and your late-night visit to the portrait suggest you know its mechanism. The fingerprint matches the paint on your smock, carelessly left when you refilled the reservoir. Clara's face crumpled. I didn't mean harm. I wanted the portrait preserved, not sold off. I studied Moreau's work, found his study, and used his design to scare them. The locket was a bonus, but I never took it. Miss Marple nodded. Your passion betrayed you, my dear. But fear not, the truth is out, and the tears will stop. Clara sobbed. The portrait remained dry, its eyes no longer accusing. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. Greed and guilt wove this web, but honesty unravels it. Let us hope the crying lady rests now. Chapter 12. The Portrait's Silence. The morning mist clung to Blackthorne Manor's ivy-clad walls as Miss Jane Marple prepared to depart. The great hall, once heavy with dread, felt lighter now, its shadows softened by the pale sunlight filtering through the windows. The portrait of the crying lady hung silently, its crimson tears gone, its sorrowful eyes no longer gleaming with accusation. The mystery was solved, but Miss Marple knew the manor's wounds would take longer to heal. Clara Duval had confessed fully after the confrontation, her tears as real as the crying lady's had been false. Driven by her reverence for Julian Moreau's art, she had uncovered his hidden study and reactivated the weeping mechanism to scare Mrs. Vance into keeping the manor and its portrait intact. The locket, a tempting prize, had been secondary, though Clara swore she'd never touched it. Mrs. Vance, shaken but forgiving, chose not to press charges, provided Clara left Blackthorne and sought help for her obsession. Miss Marple stood before the portrait, her valise at her feet, her notebook tucked away. Mrs. Vance approached, her face weary but grateful. Miss Marple, you've saved us from our own fears. I don't know how to thank you. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. No need, Mrs. Vance. Truth is its own reward, though it's often a bitter one. Keep the locket safe, and perhaps share Beatrice's story. Secrets fester, but openness heals. Mrs. Vance nodded, clutching the manor's history book. I'll sell the estate, I think. Charles will protest, but it's time to let go. The Vances have carried this burden too long. A wise choice, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. She glanced at the portrait. Beatrice's tears were Moreau's cry for justice, but they've served their purpose. Let her rest. As Miss Marple made her way to the waiting car, the household gathered to see her off. Charles, subdued, avoided her gaze, his dreams of inheritance tempered by the exposed truth of his ancestors' guilt. Lydia, quieter now, seemed relieved, as if the manor's sale would free her from its gloom. Dr. Hale, his scientific pride dented, muttered about publishing a paper on chemical deceptions. Grimsby, ever enigmatic, bowed slightly, his role in The Shadows unclear but unimportant now. The car rattled down the gravel drive, and Miss Marple looked back at Blackthorne Manor, its gargoyles softened by the mist. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where village gossip often hid truths as dark as any Gothic tale. The crying lady's tears had been a spectacle, but the real mystery lay in human hearts. Clara's passion, Charles's greed, the Vances' guilt. Each had played a part, knowingly or not, in reviving Beatrice's tragedy. Opening her notebook, Miss Marple jotted a final thought. People weave stories to hide their sins, but stories, like knitting, unravel with a single loose thread. She closed it, her mind already drifting to her cottage, her roses, and the quiet rhythm of village life. As the car reached Grimwald Heath station, a local woman selling flowers glanced at her. "Heard you stop the weeping at Blackthorne," she said, her voice awed. "Was it a ghost?" Miss Marple chuckled softly. "No, my dear, just people, as always. They're far more frightening than ghosts." She boarded the train, the manor, fading into memory. The crying lady was silent, her tears no longer needed, and Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, knew that wherever secrets lingered, she would be ready to unravel them, one quiet observation at a time. Epilogue. Echoes of Blackthorne. 3 weeks had passed since Miss Jane Marple returned to her cottage in St. Mary Mead, where the roses bloomed with quiet defiance against the autumn chill. The memory of Blackthorne Manor lingered, not as a haunting but as a puzzle solved, its pieces neatly arranged in her mind. She sat by her parlour window, knitting a scarf for her nephew Raymond, when a letter arrived, its envelope bearing the postmark of Grimwald Heath. It was from Mrs. Eleanor Vance, written in her unsteady hand. "Dear Miss Marple, the manor is sold to a historian who plans to preserve its artefacts, including the crying lady. Charles has relented, though he grumbles. Lydia seems happier, free of the manor's weight. Clara has settled in London, painting under a mentor's guidance. I've donated Beatrice's locket to a museum, with her story told at last. Your wisdom lifted our curse, not Beatrice's, but our own silence." With gratitude, Eleanor Vance Miss Marple set the letter down, her lips curving into a faint smile. "How like a village," she murmured. Blackthorne's drama had mirrored the petty jealousies and hidden truths of St. Mary Mead, where a whispered scandal could ripple as fiercely as a weeping portrait. Mrs. Vance's decision to sell was sensible, though Miss Marple suspected the manor's shadows would linger in its new owner's dreams. She rose, crossing to her bookshelf, where she kept a small sketch of the crying lady, sent by Clara as a gesture of atonement. The portrait's eyes, though mere ink, still held a trace of sorrow. Miss Marple studied it, thinking of Julian Moreau, whose love for Beatrice had crafted both art and vengeance. His mechanism, carmine and ferric oxide, hidden in the frame, had been ingenious, but it was Clara's desperation to preserve his legacy that had revived it. Passion, Miss Marple knew, could be as dangerous as greed. Her thoughts drifted to the fingerprint, that small slip that had unravelled Clara's scheme. She'd never needed to test it. Clara's guilt had spilled forth under the weight of her own conscience. Miss Marple chuckled softly, recalling a St. Mary Mead grocer who'd confessed to short-changing customers after a single pointed question. People, she reflected, were their own worst betrayers. The village clock chimed, and Miss Marple glanced out the window. Mrs. Bantry was approaching, no doubt with gossip about the vicar's new curate. Miss Marple tucked the sketch away, ready to listen, knowing that even the smallest tale could hide a mystery. Blackthorne Manor had been grander than St. Mary Mead, its secrets draped in Gothic splendour. But human nature was the same everywhere, tangled, flawed, and endlessly fascinating. As she opened the door to greet Mrs. Bantry, a breeze stirred the roses carrying the faint scent of earth and time. The crying lady was silent now, her tears dried, her story told. But Miss Marple knew other portraits, real or imagined, waited in the shadows of human hearts. With her sharp eyes and sharper mind, she would be ready as always to unravel their truths, one quiet stitch at a time.